we go. All right, hello everyone. I'm here today with Sri Dharma Pravartaka Acharya of Dharma Nation. Many of you are probably already familiar with him. He's been putting out educational content about Sanatana Dharma, colloquially known as Hinduism. I've also been interested in Vedanta, Sanatana Dharma, so it's a great pleasure to speak with, how should I refer to you, Acharya?
Acharya is fine, absolutely.
So I'm very excited to have this discussion today. But yeah, please go ahead and introduce yourself. Where can people find you? What are you about?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity of being interviewed. You have a truly wonderful show. I've seen several of your shows now, actually, interviews you've done, debates, things like that. And let me just say, you have a wonderful approach. In fact, about half an hour ago, I was discussing you with one of my students here, actually, and saying how you have a perfect approach to philosophy as far as attitude. And I'm sorry to start the introduction talking about me by first talking about you, but just let me get this out. When it comes to philosophy, I know philosophy somewhat well. I've been studying it for 50 years, both personally but academically. I have a PhD in philosophy of religion, and I've studied everything: Western, so-called Eastern, Chinese, Indian, the entirety of Western philosophy. And when it comes to contemporary individuals who try to express philosophical thoughts, unfortunately, there's a lot of ego involved. That's why I don't engage in debates. I actually do very few interviews with people. What I've seen with your approach is precisely the philosophical approach, and that is to approach these important topics with humility, with open-mindedness, not with a gotcha sort of mentality. Oh, let me see if I can best this person or that person. No, it's a matter of simple and humble inquiry. So I very much like the way that you do your shows and that you truly understand the spirit of philosophy. So let me just say that first of all.
Well, thank you so much. That's great to hear.
Yeah. And as for myself, I'll try to make it very brief. For myself, I have been a follower of what is called the tradition of Sanatana Dharma for approximately 50 years, something like that. Consciously, I like to say to people, because truthfully, unconsciously, I have been following it truly all my life. But I first read the Bhagavad Gita at the age of 10. And of course, like with so many people, I was searching for the meaning of life. What is everything about? What is the nature of God? I understood that there was God. That I never doubted. But I wanted to know, what is the nature of God? What is the nature of self? What is the nature of the totality of this reality that we find around us? And then, of course, what does all of that imply as far as ethics, how we should live, etc.? What's right? What's wrong? So that's what started my own philosophical, spiritual journey. When I read Bhagavad Gita, very specifically, I knew that, oh, this is different from anything else I had read. Because even at the age of 10, I had already read the Bible, the Quran, quite a few works, quite a few scriptures of what we call the world religions. And I finally read Bhagavad Gita, and I had the overwhelming impression that this was truly the very loving voice of God speaking to me. And from that moment on, consciously, I was following Sanatana Dharma. Very soon thereafter, at the age of about 12, I started to practice yoga. I was practicing meditation almost from the beginning, but I was practicing meditation, yoga, continuing to read and read and read. And to make what's actually a very long story extremely short, I ended up becoming a full-time monk, mostly in the New York area. I lived in several ashramas in New York, in Manhattan, in Brooklyn, and Long Island, and Queens. Um, Soon thereafter, I left for India. The first time was in 1985. And I went there very specifically to study with a preeminent guru, Bhakti-Rakshaka Sridhar Swami was his name. And if you've heard of Prabhupada, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, this person was his god brother. So they were both initiated by the same guru. So I went to India again, first time, 1985, studied with him. Then I went back a year later, 86, studied with him more, and I took what's called Brahmana initiation. So I'm initiated as a Vedic priest. I wear what's called a Upavita Sutra, a Brahmana thread, etc. And as far as my practice, it always has been, and if anything, this only deepens as time goes on. It has always been radically and unapologetically orthodox and as authentic as possible. This was, even as a child, something I knew I needed to do, and that is if I'm going to embrace a spiritual tradition, I understood don't play games. Don't play games. Enter into it as deeply and as purely as you can. So from the beginning, I have been practicing Sanatana Dharma, not in accordance with really any modern scholars or academicians or recent books, recent meaning the last 100 years, or anything like this, but truly in accordance with the Vedic scriptures. That is my primary source of information, are the primary scriptures. And I've read all the Vedic scriptures at this point in my life. I've been reading them for 50 years. So this was my approach. Having come back to America from India, I realized that I needed to couple my personal practice, experience, knowledge with then something academic. Plus, I should mention in 1986, my guru told me to become a guru. And that overwhelmed me. I didn't know what that meant, what I was supposed to do. So I came back to America, and a few years later, I started my academic career. I went to college. I went to Loyola University in Chicago. I got my bachelor's degree there, majoring in philosophy, minoring in theology. I then went on to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I earned a master's degree and then a PhD, essentially in philosophy of religion. It's interesting. This is how you do things in graduate school. The department was languages and cultures of Asia. But then within that, you pick a track. And my track was religious studies. And then within that, I specialized in philosophy of religion. And I studied with Keith Yandel, who at the time that he was alive, he's passed away now, was considered one of the top 5 professors of philosophy of religion on the face of the earth. He was a phenomenal individual. And I studied with him. In the meantime, of course, all this time, I'm thinking to myself, well, my guru wanted me not to be a professor, which I had no intention of being. I need to be a guru. So in the meantime, in 1998, I founded a movement called the International Sanatana Dharma Society. And my life now consists literally 100% of being a spiritual teacher. I do nothing else. I don't have side jobs. I don't do this to make money or to have fame. Indeed, my disciples who come here are sometimes shocked when they see that I have a little sleeping bag in my office. And that's sometimes where I sleep, several times a night. I just sleep on the floor. Yes, I am a full-time guru and spiritual teacher in, again, the most orthodox sense imaginable. As far as our primary website, it's dharmacentral.com. That's where people can find out more about my work and my books. I've written 13 books now at this point. And that is it. That's where people can contact me. So that's the short introduction to my life.
Well, excellent. Okay. Would you mind giving us a brief primer on philosophy of religion? What subjects does that entail? And what's your kind of school of thought within philosophy of religion?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, philosophy of religion, very generally speaking, I will speak about this in a way that touches upon the academic understanding, but then also the true understanding as well. So kind of bridge both. Philosophy of religion covers all philosophy itself. So it covers everything from the highest mode of philosophy, that is divine ontology, to then a step down, ontology itself, what is the nature of being, and vis-a-vis other states of being. It covers certainly epistemology. And in fact, my dissertation specifically was on Vedic epistemology. That is, how it is that we're capable of even knowing anything, whether empirically, whether intellectually, whether in a transcendent sense, how do we know? Again, that's what I kind of specialized in for my dissertation. It certainly covers what we would call ethics. That is, how we are to act in such a way within the world that we most reflect in our actions a dharma, that is the natural way, but also the will of God, in such a way that we bring we bring good into the world and not its opposite. That's stating ethics in, certainly the most broadest sort of way. But again, it also deals interestingly with other fields of philosophy. Now I'm leaving academia somewhat aside behind, and now I'm dealing specifically with Vedic philosophy. Because when we deal with Vedic philosophy, this field covers everything. And interestingly, this is something that until I started writing, very few people in the West really fully comprehended. And this is what I'm trying to express. Sanatana Dharma, the Vedic path, deals not only with philosophy, religion, spirituality, all the accoutrements of theology, i.e., all the practical elements, ritual, sadhana, that is spiritual practice, etc. It certainly deals with that. But amazingly, it also deals with politics. It also deals with economics. It also deals with social structure. It deals with history. It deals with quite literally every single field of the human experience. And this is the aspect of Vedic spirituality that, again, up until recently, people didn't really know, people didn't really touch upon. If you were to ask people, let's say 20 years ago, what is Vedic politics? What is the science of politics, political science in accordance with Vedic spirituality? Nobody can answer. Really, there was no one who could answer. Now people are beginning to be able to answer that. And then again, economics and so many other allied fields. People would kind of pretend that they understood science from a Vedic lens a little bit, but some did, some didn't. So really, when we talk about Vedic philosophy itself, we're talking about the full spectrum of academic fields, but also the human experience.
Interesting. Okay. Would you say that the Artha Shastra is the true Vedic political philosophy, or is reflective of it? Just curious for my own sake, because I intended to read that at some point. I've heard that it's sort of like the Indian Machiavelli, or something like that.
Yes, that was written by Kautilya, otherwise known as Chanakya Pandita. It does deal with politics to some degree, but interestingly, see that this is an instance in which, again, there's the academic understanding of things Vedic versus the actual understanding that has been there for 5,000 years. Interestingly, historically, when people want to understand political theory in accordance with Sanatana Dharma, Artha Shastra is considered secondary. What is considered primary is Mahabharata. So this great epic literature called the Mahabharata, which deals very deeply with politics and more than anything with governance. See, there's a difference between politics versus governance. Politics, of course, one engages in order to come to the point where one can govern. But then once one is in that position that, I am now the ruler of my nation, governance policy is something different. Mahabharata deals with both and very, very in-depth. But as far as Artha Shastra, yes, there's a lot that's in there as well. And interestingly, when it comes to politics, you find traces of very good teachings on political theory all throughout the Vedic scriptures. So in many Puranas, the Ramayana, so many, many different places. But again, I would say primarily Mahabharata is where you see Raja Vidya, you see the science of kings and how it is that they engage in politics.
Right, hence the parallel to Machiavelli. So many people have heard of the six schools of Hinduism. Do you think that's something of a misnomer? Do you subscribe to one or another of these kind of major schools, philosophical schools, or is there really kind of one consistent, true Vedic philosophy, and then everything else is kind of any other perspective on it is erring in some way? What's your view on that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. On the one hand, yes, what are called the Shadarshanas, that is the six schools of philosophy, that those categories have always been accepted within traditional Sanatana Dharma. In fact, some people, including myself, actually say that there is a Sapta Darshana, that there are actually seven schools if you include what's called the grammarian school, Vyakarana, the school of grammar. But that's all right. Most people accept that, yes, there are these six schools of philosophy. Now, this is the difficulty in understanding these six schools. is that some people believe that the six schools are literally at odds with one another. People love conflict. And when historians, especially, and especially secular modernist historians, tend to look at the history of ideas, they love the idea of conflict. Oh, this school hated that school tried to refute this school, and they just go on and on like this. And while you certainly do find that to some degree, when it comes to Vedic philosophy specifically, you find that less. And when I say Vedic philosophy, I'm not talking about, oh, the last 1,000 years. I'm talking about very early on, early part of the Kali Yuga. So we're talking about very much BC era. What you find is that the six schools really are not in conflict. So Orthodox Vedic practitioners accept all six of them. I do. Again, anyone who is Orthodox does. However, they involve varying areas of concern. And because of that, people will think that, oh, there's no connection between them all. No, what we see is that when you read the Vedic scriptures, elements of all six schools are mentioned. So, for example, yoga. Yoga is certainly omnipresent throughout the totality of the Vedic world. You find nyaya, you find logic. Well, thinking in a very reasonable, rational, logical sort of way, this is something that every Vedic acharya has to have the ability to do. Again, epistemology. Epistemology is very much a part of the Nyaya school. And you can go on and on like that. You have the Mimamsa school. The Mimamsa school deals more with ritual, the idea of what is the nature of karma, of action itself. It tends to be more ritualistic oriented, more the idea of almost a type of spiritual materialism. Well, that is also an integral part of what is called Sanatana Dharma. So truthfully, we see them all as being in harmony. There will be differences between them, but it's a matter of different emphasis. Sankhya is a very good example of a philosophical school, the traces of which you find in almost all of the other philosophical schools. You find Sankhya in yoga, you find it in Vedanta, you find it everywhere. Now, all that being said, it is pretty much universally recognized that of the six schools, let's say the crown, the head of all these six schools is Vedanta, is certainly Vedanta. And you find that in the very name itself, Veda Anta. Anta meaning the culmination, the end of, and then Veda meaning knowledge, wisdom. So Vedanta pretty much is accepted as the most important of these schools, and not for no reason, actually. It's for very good reason that it's considered to be the most important. And that is because of the subject matter. You see, okay, Nyaya. Nyaya deals with logic, with reasoning, how to do proper syllogisms, et cetera, et cetera. However, that, of course, is only a tool for something higher. The same thing with yoga. Yoga is Vedic philosophy and practical application. So how to do the asanas, how to do breathing exercises. There's also a distinct philosophical component to it as well. Sankhya. Sankhya is basically the division of the ideas of matter versus consciousness, and on like this. They deal with specific topics. However, what should be the highest philosophical pursuit of all? That is what I call divine ontology. That is, what is the nature of God? It's one thing to study, logic. That's a very particular thing. Or to study the differentiation between consciousness and matter. Again, very specific. But then what is the origin of all, the ontological origin and source of all things? That is what, to state it very neutrally and truly philosophical terms, we could call the absolute. What in Sanskrit is called Brahman, that is the absolute. That's the highest topic. That is, again, cutting to the chase of, not just ethics, not just, how should I act, not even merely what is my own nature as a self, but going to the self of myself, going to that which is the origin of all things. That is Vedanta. That deals with what is truly the inner nature of God. And there is nothing higher. So Vedanta is definitely considered to be the supreme philosophy.
And when you say Vedanta, is that synonymous with Advaita Vedanta?
God, no.
No. Okay. So that's
No.
Go ahead and clarify that.
As I say that, I have one of my students here who's laughing. No, no. And the reason why I say that so adamantly is, yeah, sadly, in fact, before I answer that directly, may I back up for just a moment? Just a
Sure.
moment. Just take a minute. Sadly, what I have seen as someone who has studied and practiced, more important than study is nothing, someone who has practiced this path for 50 years, what I've seen is sadly, there are more misconceptions about the Vedic path than every other religion upon the face of the earth combined. And unfortunately, most people who even think that they know the path somewhat well, they got their information from some dusty academic books, they read some Wikipedia articles, etc. Most likely, they're going to get a lot of it wrong. And this is one instance in which this is the case. Sadly, a lot of Westerners think that by the term Vedanta is meant Advaita Vedanta, not understanding that there are actually a minimum of 22 major schools of Vedanta, major ones. The number actually increases if you look at minor ones, some of which don't even exist anymore. Yeah, we just know about them historically. But there are dozens of schools of Vedanta, the vast majority of which are not Advaitic in nature, the vast majority of which are very much the opposite. Now, if I can go a little bit into this, just to give definitions for people who may not understand these terms. What is meant by Advaita? Advaita is the school of philosophy that was founded by Gaudapada and then later made famous by his grand disciple Shankaracharya. Advaita basically has the premise that there is only one reality. All that exists is indeed Brahman. What is Brahman? What we in the West, using English, would call God, the absolute. That absolute is fully transcendent. That absolute is perfect. That absolute is of the nature of pure consciousness, of knowledge, of bliss, and we can go on like this. However, these are not attributes of Brahman at the same time. They make this very clear. And our problem as beings in existence, as human persons, is that we are under the illusion that something exists outside of that Brahman. Now, how do we gain liberation, existential freedom, spiritual freedom? By coming to the realization that there is nothing but Brahman. I don't exist as an individual being. No one exists. This world does not exist. It is all literally Maya. That is Advaita Vedanta in the smallest nutshell. Now, what is interesting is that the vast majority of Vedantic schools do not ascribe to this in any way whatsoever. So, thus, you have different schools. You have Vishishta Advaita, you have Dvaita, you have Bheda Abheda, and many others, Shuddha Advaita. Again, there are a minimum of 22 major schools. And they disagree with this completely. And for myself, I am not a follower of Advaita. I am personally a follower of what is called Vishishta Advaita, which goes back a very long way. The most famous philosopher in this school is Ramanuja, but truthfully, it existed since the beginning of time. And there were teachers of this school going back thousands upon thousands of years before him. So no, Advaita and Vedanta are not synonymous. Rather, there are many differing views as far as what is true Vedanta.
Right. Most of what I've learned about Vedanta came from the Vedanta Society started by Vivekananda. I went to the school or the temple in Hollywood, and it was a real great resource for me to be able to sit down with the monks and have these conversations, and I could understand their worldview. And I don't think I would have understood what I have typically called Hinduism as well without that. And they seemed like, very holy men in a way where they did seem exempt from the world, but also there was a kind of detachedness that ultimately left me feeling like there's something missing. And on several occasions they were asked in Q&A sessions about like questions of morality. You're always pointing to this oneness of all things and realizing the illusion of separation, and yet to someone with like a Christian upbringing or a Western disposition, like there does seem to be this real conflict between good and evil in the world, and it's like they kind of sideline that. And so I'm not, strictly in line with the teachings of the Vedanta Society. I really never was. They were just a great teaching resource for me. So what's your opinion on the Vedanta Society specifically as a institution, and then how, I can't remember the name of the position you subscribe to, as opposed to Advaita Vedanta, if, please, thank you.
Sure, Vishishta Advaita. Yes, and I don't want to speak ill of any organization, so I'll just speak about this historically and philosophically more than anything. The Vedanta Society was founded by Swami Vivekananda, who he himself was a follower of Ramakrishna. Ramakrishna did not found the Vedanta Society. It was actually Vivekananda who started it several decades after Ramakrishna passed away. And it's interesting, my latest book is called Radical Universalism, where I actually go very deep into this, into the history of modern day, and yes, let's call it Hinduism, because modern day Hinduism is quite different from actual authentic Sanatana Dharma. Many people were not aware of this until my book came out, and this is actually the second edition. The first edition came out in maybe 2006, something like that, where I explained that a lot of modern accretions that are there now in modern day Hinduism are actually not Vedic. They go back no more than, if we're lucky, 200 years. A lot of the teachings that are there are actually very recent and actually very much colored by modernity. So when we look at Hinduism today, we will see a lot of contradictions that are there, a lot of things that don't make sense, that are not found in the scriptures, a lot of things that are acquiescing to the very worst of modernity. We also see a lot of interface between New Age and modern Hinduism, which I'm completely opposed to. Sadly, the Vedanta Center falls into this category of a very modern organization that is presenting Sanatana Dharma with a modernist, progressive sort of face. And that being the case, serious followers of Sanatana Dharma don't take their teachings very seriously. It is good as an introduction for people who, like you said, maybe they basically just know Christianity. They know nothing about this path. They'll go to a Vedanta center and at least learn something about the Bhagavad Gita or something like this. But while that was useful when these ideas were first being presented to the West, so again, late 19th century throughout the 20th century, at this point it's dated. Now people have the ability to follow pure Sanatana Dharma, not a watered down sort of Hinduism where it's mix and match. It has many, many different ideas just kind of sprinkled in. So again, the only way to truly understand Sanatana Dharma is on its own terms, and this is true for any religion. If a person knows nothing about Buddhism and they want to seriously study Buddhism, don't go to some New Age fraud on the internet who really himself knows nothing about it, and he's going to kind of mix it and match it with New Age ideas and crystals and Anunnaki and this and that and all kinds of craziness. No, you want to study Buddhism, go to traditional teachers, go to Thailand, study Theravada Buddhism with true strict monks, study the Pali literature, etc. Well, the same thing with Sanatana Dharma. If a person truly wants to understand this, it's important that they approach someone who is an authentic guru. What does that mean? It means many things, but at the very least, that they're not someone who kind of mixes a lot of modern concepts into something that is meant to be pure. So now, as far as the differences, philosophically, the Vedanta Society of Vivekananda follow what academically is called Neo-Advaita, Neo-Vedanta. It's called both, actually. So in other words, it is a type of Vedanta, but also mixed in with a lot of things from other religions, other paths, and specifically late 19th century. It's actually quite dated, their philosophical system. So, for example, they believe in globalism, in radical universalism, in the idea that all religions are one, all religions are the same. They tend to be, generally speaking, progressive in their mood. That means both politically, but also in every way. They believe in qualitative evolutionism. They believe in the idea that, oh, as time goes on, humanity is actually qualitatively getting better and better and better. And I can go on. Again, this is something I've written a book about. That's the Vedanta Society of Ramakrishna Vivekananda. On the other hand, authentic Sanatana Dharma, represented by the philosophical school that I follow, Vishishta Advaita, is basically the opposite of all that. If you want to understand the difference between authentic Sanatana Dharma versus modern Hinduism and Neo-Hinduism, let me give you this very precise nutshell. With Sanatana Dharma, as I and our movement, but then all others as well, as we practice it, we have not given in. We have not surrendered 1 inch, 1 ounce to modernity. We follow Sanatana Dharma. We endeavor to, with great humility, the way it was practiced in the last yuga, literally 6,000 years ago. We don't care about modernity. We don't care about the modern world. We interact with it. In fact, on the contrary, I'm famous for this, that I interact with the modern world more than any other guru alive. I know even the lingo. I use NPC all the time, for example. We interact with the modern world, but we have not acquiesced to it. We have not given in to the modern world. Whereas other more modern forms of Hinduism, they have.
And what is the meaning of Vishishta Advaita?
Qualified non-dualism. So this is the idea, is that, again, with Advaita, with actual Advaita, the idea is that all that there is oneness, and without distinction, without qualities, without attributes, without you and me and God. Literally, there is one reality, that is Brahman. With Vishishta Advaita, on the other hand, we accept that God in himself, again, divine ontology, in his actual essence, is a unitary being. God is indeed one, but with attributes, with Vishishta, with qualitative attributes as well. So God is one unitary being who is the source of all things. And the Vedanta Sutra says, Janma Yasya Yataha. This is one of the definitions of God. God is that from which all things proceed. So God in himself is this transcendent being who is indeed one, but all things proceed from God. God has qualities. God has attributes. But those attributes are just as sacred as is God. So this is why we can understand that when we look at reality, capital R, that means all things, we understand that it is a harmony and that it is centered upon that first of all things, the karana karanam, that which is the cause of all causes, God, on the one hand. On the other hand, there is great diversity, natural diversity that is there as well. So thus, this is why there is God, but then there is also us, individual souls who also are distinct from God. There's also materiality, which we see as, on the one hand, illusory, but on the other hand, very real. You see, for Advaita, the idea is that the material world, the concrete, it does not exist. For us, we say, no, it has existence. It just has temporary existence. It has less meaningful existence. And its nature is such that it's neutral. All the materiality can be used for good or for bad, as is the case for anything in this world. If you have a tool, if you have a hammer, you can use a hammer in the proper way, to use it on nails, or you could attack someone with it. You could use it in an evil way. In the same way, materiality itself, there's nothing evil about. There's nothing bad here. There's nothing harmful here, unless we, as living beings with will, choose to use it in the wrong way. So that's the difference between Advaita versus Vishishta Advaita, is that we take into account literally all things, but also in its proper ontological category of the hierarchy of being. We accept that matter is real, it exists, but ontologically it's the lowest let's say, strata of reality, you know. So similar to Platonism, interestingly. So this is the difference.
Yes, I was just going to say that. It does sound very similar to Platonism. The one emanating all things, all the way out to the lowest level, matter. And I've even heard Platonism described as a kind of qualified non dualism. So, what is the relation ontologically then between the one and the analogous part of our soul that makes us fundamentally one? Because we have different aspects of our soul. We have our obviously appetites and our affections. We have our intellectual operations, and then there's in Platonism like the kind of henad or unity of our soul, and that participates of the one in some way, like an imitation or an emanation out of the one, but it is distinct in some sense. But in Vishishta Advaita, what is the kind of ontological relation? Is it like we are offshoots from the one and it's the same basic substance at our core? Is it like a creation ex nihilo where there's a real fundamental divide between the divine substance and mortal substance? Or how does that work?
Very good. Now, you've asked a question which I'm sure you're aware is going to take some time to answer, but very good question. Yes, let me go into this. First of all, as far as ex nihilo creation, that's not something that's accepted outside of the Abrahamic religions. So that includes Sanatana Dharma. We believe that all things that are what we would call energies or powers of God, whether spiritual or material, are of necessity eternal. So there is no ex nihilo creation either of materiality or of ourselves as souls. So yes, that's the case with that. But now starting from the very beginning, as far as the differentiation between the Platonic understanding of these questions and the Vedic understanding, there is some difference. And as we go on, we'll go into this. And let me say, of all the Western schools of philosophy, and I've studied them all, from the most ancient to the most recent, Platonism and what is sometimes called Neoplatonism, I don't accept that term. I accept Plotinus as being just as much as Platonist as Plato himself was. But still, just to use these academic terms, of all the schools of Western philosophy, Platonism and Neoplatonism are the closest to Sanatana Dharma, philosophically. At the same time, there are some very important differences that will come out as I now proceed to answer your question. So there is indeed what in Platonism, Neoplatonism would be considered the one, that is God, that is Brahman, that is what in the Vedic understanding is really the same, from what I've seen, as again the Platonist understanding. That is that absolute as a panentheistic being, that is as a being who on the one hand is fully transcendent in every sense of that term, a being who is not touched by materiality, temporality, spatiality, cause and effect, etc. On the one hand. On the other hand, as you stated it, and as is stated in Platonism, is capable of emanating various qualities from, and again, will be very neutral, itself. We won't say himself just yet, but we'll get there because it is a him, to be blunt. There are various emanations that come from itself that then comprise all of the lower echelons of this entire hierarchy of being. Now, all that being said, of these various emanations, one could say that one of the primary ones, but also which consists of its own nature qualitatively, is the vast array of individual souls. So what we call our own souls, yourself, myself, any living being. Now, qualitatively, they are considered to be of the same nature, that is, of the nature of consciousness, pure awareness, which transcends materiality. So when it comes to, for example, the transcendental understanding of the nature of God, we share in that nature. We also are beings who we transcend materiality. We are also eternal. We are of the nature of bliss, of wisdom, of goodness, etc. We share in many of these attributes. So qualitatively, there's not much of a difference between the individual soul and the Supreme. but quantitatively there is. And more, there is a difference in that one is the originator, one is, one could say, that from which all things proceed versus that which is the effect. And again, we're using very imperfect language to describe a transcendental relationship where really there is no cause and effect. So, in other words, it's not literally the case that at a certain point in what we call time, we come from God. We also, like God, have always existed, but we exist in a relationship of dependence upon God. God is the supreme independent, whereas we are dependent upon that which is our source. So it gets a little tricky, but for people, I'm sure you get this completely. For anyone who's philosophically inclined, they understand what I'm saying here. Now, all that being the case, so again, qualitatively, there's not much distinction. Quantitatively, and as far as dependence and originality, there is a distinction in that we are finite, God is infinite. Now, this begs a question. This is almost a little bit of an aside, a philosophical tangent that's kind of an aside. Because I remember once years ago when I was giving a lecture, I explained this, that, we are finite, God is infinite. And a person raised his hand and said, really? So the individual soul is truly finite? It reaches a certain point in which it cannot grow beyond that? And I explained to the person, no, it can grow eternally. So then it's not finite, it's infinite. In and of itself, it is infinite, but in comparison to God, it's finite. This is how I explained it. And then I explained how there isn't just one concept or one type of infiniteness, but there are several. And as I was explaining this, one of my students was the chair of the physics department here in Omaha at the University of Nebraska. And he raised his hand and he said, Chatterjee, it's interesting. In modern physics, we accept the same thing. There isn't just one infinite. There are multiple infinites, some greater than others, and all distinct from one another. So in this way, one could say, on the one hand, is the infinite soul, is the finite soul infinite? In some ways it is, but not in comparison to the true infinite, to God. So I hope that wasn't too much of a tangent, but this is how deep Vedantic philosophy goes, where we even literally make that distinction between different types of infinities. Mm-hmm. Now, all that being said, now this is where there's a little bit of a difference between classical Platonism versus Vedanta, versus Sanatana Dharma. And that is that we accept that the soul is not a composite being, but that, like God, it itself also is a unitary being. It itself is a monadic being. Of course, again, in a finite sense, in comparison to the true infinite. But we understand that the soul has powers, not parts, but powers. And that's the only distinction. So what you described before, the appetite of the soul, and this tripartite understanding, Platonic understanding of the soul, we accept that the soul has those abilities and more, actually, not just three, but there are many abilities. But we don't see them as parts of the soul. It's not like you pull up the hood of an engine and you look at all the different parts of the engine. You can say, this is the carburetor, this is that. No, you can't make that distinction because they are powers, not parts. Rather, the soul itself is monadic, as is God, but just in finite form. But otherwise, yes, we accept that these are parts of the attributes of soul. And for that matter, we accept that self-awareness is one of the attributes. Desire, so as far as appetite, yes, that's certainly another aspect. And desire in every sense, not just material desire, but transcendent desire, spiritual desire as well, is considered to be part of the soul. Awareness of other, will is also a part of the soul. And we can go on and on like this, but they're not parts. They are rather aspects of the soul. They are powers of the soul, shaktis of the soul. So does that answer your question?
Yes. I still would like to get deeper into the connection between individual souls and the absolute. But a lot of what you said seems totally consistent with Platonism to me. Proclus talks about different degrees of infinitude, and something can be finite from one perspective, but relative to a lower being may be infinite from that lower being's perspective. The teaching of the tripartite soul, Proclus, in his commentaries on the Republic, says uh, Plato is not describing the three parts of the soul, strictly speaking, but of the soul body composite. And so you need to kind of separate out. There is this thumos, spirited energy that's joining the true soul, which is the rational soul, for Neoplatonists at least, with the body, and then that appetitive activity, ensouled activity of the body is distinct again from that spirit and from that rational soul. But the rational soul is really the true soul, and that's described exactly as you describe, in composite, but with all these various energies. So yeah, it's really remarkable how similar these systems are. Of course, I think that is because Platonism was influenced by Vedanta. So that seems like the clear way to interpret it.
Yeah, in fact, can I speak about that for 1 second,
Sure.
actually? Because this is actually a very important historical point that almost no one talks about, but which is actually crucial. And I'm very blunt about this. It's one of my goals to educate the Western world about this. Um, Ancient European philosophy, the good aspects of it, not the atheistic forms, the materialistic forms, the school of skepticism, sophism, etc. But again, Platonism, Pythagoreanism, really all owe their ideas ultimately to, and I won't say India, I make a distinction between India versus Sanatana Dharma. Dharma is truly something that you can't ascribe to just a geographical location. You can't say that Dharma belongs to India. No, it's truly universal. It's natural law. But I would easily argue that whether it's Platonism, Pythagoreanism, any sort of Western school of philosophy like this, for that matter, also the European paganisms, the pre-Christian European religions, they owe all of their ideas, ultimately, if you trace back far enough, to Sanatana Dharma, to the Vedic way. And that's something that I talk about all the time and that I am trying to educate the world about. Ultimately, what it comes down to, everything is Dharma, the natural way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just in terms of the textual evidence, I think the best argument for the earliest philosophy is the Upanishadic writings. There's no form of philosophy as we know it before that. So back to this question about the connection between individual souls and the Supreme. One thing that Proclus says that raises further questions is that each soul remains at its level and cycles eternally. So there is rebirth, you can change bodies, but that soul is one fixed entity that always remains at one level. Now, I have an intuition that something's wrong with that, but I think it might have to do with the relation between the true self and the soul. If these are not the same, then we can treat the soul as an eternal, stable structure and still admit that there is a possibility of transcendence of one individual soul. So what is the relationship between that self that we really are and then the soul? Are they the same? How do they differ, if not?
Let me tell you something. Your intuition is very, very good. Your philosophical intuition is quite good. I like Proclus. He was a wonderful philosopher. He wrote wonderful commentaries on Plato, and he had very good ideas. But yeah, again, this is where I was saying that there are some distinctions between Platonism, whether very traditional or somewhat later, and Sanatana Dharma on the other hand. When it comes to the idea, first of all, let's talk about what is the relationship between the absolute and the soul. And we can go through that very quickly, actually, because that's a necessary foundation to then understand what you were just asking. The relationship between, let's just use the shorthand, let's just say God, between God and then the individual selves, is that, again, qualitatively they're the same, quantitatively they're not, in that many ways, but for this question, the individual soul is capable of falling into illusion. God is not. God is eternally transcendent to all illusion, to all materiality, to all that is temporal, etc., while at the same time having the ability to be immanent within it as its very ground of being, as its very sustainer. But the soul, the individual soul, on the other hand, has the ability to fall under illusion, to make mistakes, and to thus be deluded. Now, as far as the ontological relationship between the two, let me first give this example because it really helps a lot to understand philosophically what's being said. The example that's given is that of the sun versus the sunshine. Earlier today, now it's getting a little bit late here where I am, but earlier in the day when I was in the temple, the sun was streaming in, and you could see that the sun was in the temple. Now, linguistically, that makes sense for me to say that, right? The sun is in the temple. Oh, look, the sun is coming into the temple. If the sun actually came into the temple, we'd all be dead. But yet, why is it that we can say that? Because we see the sunshine as, in a way, non-distinct from the sun, because it has the sun as its source. It has many of the same properties as the sun, but at the same time, we see that distinction necessarily that is there. Sunshine is not the sun, and vice versa. In the same way, we individual souls are like the sunshine. We come from God. We emanate from God. We have many of the properties of God, etc. We have the ability of having great mobility. So thus the sunshine was in the temple here a short time ago, etc. But there is still that distinction that is there. The sunshine, i.e. God, is the source of all things, including ourselves, versus the sunshine, which is ourselves. So that is kind of explaining in the smallest nutshell form the relation between the two. Now, getting back to what you specifically asked me, and in a very small nutshell, can you just remind me of the exact question? Because I want to get it right.
Right. So Proclus says that souls are sort of consigned to always cycle
Right.
at the same level.
Okay.
My intuition is that there must be a possibility of transformation between these levels of soul. So if I'm like a level 3 soul, there has to be some way to get up to a level 9 soul. I don't just have to cycle at level 3 forever, right?
Right.
So is that right? Or
Yes. All right. Let me tell you the Vedic understanding and how Proclus is a little bit off on this. Actually, a little bit off, but off to the point where it's the difference between life and death almost. But let me explain the Vedic understanding. The Vedic understanding is that, again, our own soul itself, in the highest sense of that term, what in Sanskrit is called Atman, the ultimate true self that we are, is in itself perfect. It is in itself a being who is really incapable of evil, incapable of anything that is of the opposite of the spiritual, of the opposite of pure consciousness. However, being finite, it can forget itself. It can indeed fall into what's called illusion, into what in Sanskrit is called avidya. Avidya means ignorance, illusion, maya. There are many different words for this. Now, that being the case, the individual soul has the ability to forget itself. Why does it do that? Because it chooses to. At a certain point, it chooses, because it has will and it has desire, the two necessary prerequisites for choosing. It has the ability to choose that which is in its interest versus that which is not. When it chooses the latter, it now finds itself perceptually within what we call the material world. Now, again, the soul itself, the Atman, remains ever pure, but being an illusion, what is created is an illusory self. What is called, and I'm sorry I'm throwing out a lot of Sanskrit, I love Sanskrit, it's the language I study, I love Sanskrit. Ahankara. Ahankara means false self, that self which is artificially constructed, and which it, in ignorance, identifies with. So in this way, I guess one could say that there are two selves, but really there's the true self and the artificial self, the egoic self that we temporarily identify with. Now, all that being said, of course, we are the true self. We are to overcome that illusory identity. What does that mean? Oh, you can identify with anything. I always give the example. Imagine that, there's a painting of a beautiful guy, a beautiful man. He's muscular. He looks perfect in every way. And if you were to start to identify with that and say, oh, no, that's actually me. I'm not going to eat. I'm going to try to feed the painting. I'm going to give all good things to the painting. That's the ahankara. That's the fake self, the false self. The vast majority of living beings in this world, they are identifying with that. And that is the root of the existential problem of living beings within this world. This is why we find ourselves here undergoing happiness and suffering, temporary happiness and suffering, happiness and suffering. And then something else that Sanatana Dharma has in common with the Platonic school, reincarnation. As we make ethical decisions in this world, good or bad, we now have karma. We have created our future existences. So we are going to go through transmigration, reincarnate, reincarnate. Now, the thing is, what is actually reincarnating? Well, of course, it's this fake self. And what does that include? Oh, we can go very deeply into even the components of that. That also includes material mind, material, temporary mind, material intellect. Again, that sense of identity. It includes emotions. It certainly includes body. The body is very temporary. But still, as far as those higher elements, that's what reincarnates. That's what reincarnates. The goal in Sanatana Dharma, and I would say in very traditional classical Platonism, absolutely in Pythagoreanism, the goal is to eventually end the reincarnation, to leave behind that artificial self, that fake self that we have identified with, in fact, selves, you could say, lifetime after lifetime, and to eventually come to the point of true self-realization, knowing that actual Atma, that actual soul, self-realization, knowing ourselves and who we truly are, but then not stopping there. Then what is that true self in relation to God, who is the ultimate self? And knowing all this now, and knowing not just intellectually, of course, this is the other mistake that many people make. They think that they can read their way to liberation, that they can read their way to salvation. I've read more books than most people have hair on their head. You can't read your way to liberation. You can't read your way to salvation. Rather, it's a matter of practice and deep spiritual realization. But once we have that, then at that point we have liberation. The reincarnation stops. We transcend the illusion. We transcend our own ignorance. We transcend the false ego, that ahankara, that misidentification of our true self with other things that are not ourself. Again, like the painting. That's the definition of a crazy person. He thinks he is the painting. Well, the moment you cure him, he realizes, no, I guess I'm not that. I am here.
Okay. Is the ahankara the same as what's called the jiva? Or are these separate
No, they're
concepts?
separate.
What is the jiva compared to that? How does that fit in?
Sure. Good question. Let me, in fact, give you these three terms. There is Atman, there is Jiva, and there is Ahankara. And ontologically, they are from the highest to the lowest. Atman is our true self. There is nothing higher as far as our personhood. That is the true self, what we could call soul, spirit. There's so many different names. Jiva is that being in illusion. That being in illusion, but the Atman in illusion. Ahankara is the illusory identity itself. So it's a subtle distinction. So there's Atman, true self. When that Atman is under illusion, you can't say it's pure Atman, it's Jiva. Sometimes it's called Jivatman, meaning that it's the Atman in illusion. Now, what is the illusion? The illusion is the Ahankara, that it's identifying with something unreal, that it's saying, that, oh, I am such and such age, such and such nationality, such and such height, etc. And we're identifying with that so much. My hair color is a certain color, etc. My education, my this, my that. Not understanding that all of that is arbitrary and temporary. What was I in my last life? I'm not this. What will I be in a future life? Not this. Well, that's
So something that I was taught from an Advaita perspective is that the Jivatman is the individual soul and the Atman is universal. There is one Atman that all beings participate in, and that is the same as Brahman. Is that correct, or is there something wrong with that?
that's a complete misunderstanding. Yeah, that's not what the Vedic scriptures say. And again, that is something that is peculiar to very specifically Advaita Vedanta. The vast majority of authentic orthodox followers of Sanatana Dharma would not only disagree with that, the Vedic scriptures do. The Vedic scriptures make it very clear that there are two distinct terms. There is Atman, which means individual self, again, finite, limited, dependent upon that which is our source. But then there is another term, Paramatman. Paramatman means God. Parama, in fact, I'll break this down. Atman means self. Parama means the supreme. Parama Atman, Paramatman means the supreme self. So what Advaita does very sadly is they go against the Vedic scriptures because again, this is stated in the Upanishads. It gives the definitions. Paramatman is the supreme God. Atman are individual selves dependent upon that Paramatman, that supreme God. What followers of Advaita do is they will throw out the Paramatman part and they'll just say, no, all Atman is God. Again, this is the problem, is that they believe that all that exists is God and that we are God also. You know, some more New Age inspired neo-Advaitins, what they call themselves non-dualists, will be so silly to the point where they will just bluntly say to you, no, you're God, I'm God, that's it. Once you know that, you're free. You're God, I'm God. Sadly, that's also what Luciferians say.
Yeah, no, and I think that's where this problematic moral philosophy that I noticed in Advaita Vedanta comes in. Because if we're all God, then there's no grounds for moral judgment because each of us is an absolute unto ourselves. I'm still open to the possibility that at some level there is a convergence between Atman and what was it, Para Atman or
Paramatman.
Param? Okay. Perhaps they converge in some way, or a contact is possible. I think there is a
there is contact, yes.
Okay.
And it's similar to what I was saying before. Paramatman, i.e., God, is the sun. We, Atman, individual units of consciousness, we are the sunshine. So we emanate from God. We are a part of God. We share in many of the qualities of God, but we are not God. In the same way that the sunshine is not the sun. You know, they're so close to the point where linguistically, again, you can say, oh, look, the sun's coming into the room. Well, if the sun were coming into the room, again, we'd all be dead. We understand that there's such a closeness that even though it's only the sunshine, we can say, oh, look, the sun's coming in. It's very similar. In fact, this is the Vedantic understanding.
Right. It reminds me of the notion of theosis versus henosis, talked about in Neoplatonism, where, like, for Proclus, the best that we can do is a kind of theosis where we orbit around the one or approach to the one, but there's never a kind of integration or merging into the one. Whereas some people interpret Plotinus as saying that a full henosis is possible, where we join into the unity of our soul, and then from there, that'd be like the Atman, join into the unity of everything. And there is a kind of teleological argument that I've considered here, where if God is benevolent, the absolute wants the best for all things, but it is itself, or he is himself, the best of all things, then the supreme benevolent act would be to go ahead and allow beings this full integration into the Godhead itself as their highest good. So what do you think about that kind of argument from divine benevolence?
Sure. Very, very easily demolished in that what that is saying is that God is committing suicide. In a way, when you really think about it, it's saying that God is committing suicide. God being that which is, that in which nothing greater can be conceived, and Selmian terms. God being the source of all good, the source of all that is, all that is auspicious, etc., etc. That means that necessarily that must be a unitary being, because then nothing can be there in comparison that would be lower than that. That being the case, if finite beings were to merge into God in that full sense and thus become God, what it's saying is that it is not possible for that to even be a unitary being. oneness falls apart. That is oneness in this divine ontology sense of the oneness of God. The oneness of God itself falls apart. It's as if saying God is committing suicide by that very so-called beneficent act. So thus, of necessity, God must remain a distinct being for that beneficence to even make sense.
Okay. So, just to reply to that, the defense that I could see is to go full monist, full Advaita Vedanta, and say, well, the entirety of things already was in that oneness. So it remains one, remains God. And all that's really happened is this illusion of separation has finally fallen away. So there's no change in God, there's no multiplicity. Of course, you disagree with that perspective. So
yeah, it's not a matter of disagreeing. It's a matter of, yeah, and I've actually heard that many times. It itself has an inherent contradiction that makes it absolutely fall apart, and that is this. In fact, this leads to the major criticism that philosophers in Sanatana Dharma have had against Advaita from the very beginning, and which no Advaitin, and again, I know the history of all philosophy, including so-called Indian philosophy, all the debates between Buddhists and Hindus and Advaitins, Vishishta Advaitins. This is where this idea falls apart, is that if God is already indeed this perfect unitary being, there would be no reason for God to fall into illusion. And more, if we say that God has the ability to fall into illusion. See, this is the basic premise of Advaita, Neo-Advaita, and even New Age non-dualism as it exists today, is that, again, we are all God. We've just forgotten. We've just fallen into illusion. Now, this is the problem. If, first of all, none of them are ever capable of giving a good definition of what is God. If they were capable, immediately their brains themselves would explode because they would understand the stupidity of what they just said. I am God. I've just forgotten and have fallen temporarily into illusion. My goal is to remember that I am God. What is the problem with this? The problem is that, again, they don't understand the definition of God. The moment that you, and there are many good definitions, as soon as you give them a good definition of God, that very idea falls apart, because the idea is that God is that which is the source of everything. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. God is that which transcends all materiality, all illusion, which is the source of all. That being the case, God is incapable of falling under illusion. The moment that you say that God has fallen under illusion, you're not talking about God under any strict definition of the term. And this is the problem with Advaita, is that this has been pointed out to them for 1,500 years, and they have never been able to counter it because there is no countering it. God either is perfect, incapable of falling under illusion, or God is. In other words, God is imperfect. God is capable of falling under illusion. God can make mistakes. God can be stupid. It's one or the other. And there is no in between. It's literally one or the other. If you accept Advaita, you are accepting that God has the ability to be fooled. That being the case, what the Advaitins are talking about, it might be something, or it might be nothing, but let's just say it might be something, but it's not God. It's not the absolute by definition. And that's the problem with Advaita. And on a personal side, for myself, I recognized this as a child. When I was like 13 years old, I realized when I first started to read a little bit about Advaita. And, specifically, I was reading more modern people like Swami Muktananda. I don't know if you've heard of him, but, he was a big Swami in the 1970s. And I remember reading through his book, and he literally saying this. Oh, this is our problem. I would imagine he would say with an Indian accent. This is our problem, is that we are God. Oh, but we have forgotten that we are God. And as soon as I read this, I said, wait a minute. Those are two contradictory things. I am God, that being who's incapable of forgetting, on the one hand. On the other hand, I've forgotten. I am that being, on the one hand, who is incapable of being overcome by anything inferior ontologically to my very being. my very essence. And yet, on the other hand, I have done precisely that. This is where Advaita as a philosophical system falls apart. And let me tell you, I have had the privilege, actually. Um, I spoke to several Advaita gurus about this in the last 50 years, one of which was Swami Dayananda Saraswati. He's passed away now. But at the time, he was considered one of the greatest Advaita philosophers on the face of the earth. And he actually invited me to visit his ashram. He flew me out there and everything in the early 2000s, may have been like 2002. And I was very grateful. And I had a philosophical discussion with him where, once again, I brought this to his attention now that, oh, Swamiji, this is what I consider the fundamental problem with Advaita. It cannot answer this question. To state it in almost kindergarten terms, I'm God. My problem is that I have succumbed to being not God. How does Advaita answer this? And he and I went back and forth for about an hour. He couldn't answer it until it got to the point where he just kind of went like this, just indicating, all right, I understand. And he wanted the discussion to end. They cannot answer this question. God either is perfect or God is not. God is either fully transcendent and immanent, or God is not. God either is above all other strata of ontological existence, or God is not. God either fully transcends ignorance, or God has the ability to fall under ignorance. And the question is, as philosophers, and more important, forget about philosophers, as individuals who want to know and embrace truth, which must we accept? And that's why I rejected Advaita.
Right. Okay. So, not to try to drag you into a philosophical debate on this, but it's interesting that this is such a core misunderstanding in your perspective of Vedanta, and it has so many implications for New Age, as he correctly states. So it's an important issue. There are two thoughts that occur to me. One is that God doesn't admit of definition, because definitions require a genus and a differentia, and there's no genus higher than God, so he can't really have a definition in the strict sense. And then we can't thereby deduce any facts about God from this definition, because there's no true definition of God. He has to be beyond all human categories, and so our logic just can't comprehend him. That leads to, though, a kind of quietism where, okay, so the ground of your entire system of thought is basically unthinkable, you're saying, and therefore it's leaving us without any foundation, again, in ethics, which is kind of the problematic aspect of Advaita that I can identify. The other argument is mine, which is that from divine omniscience, and I think this is in Plato, indirectly, but for the divine to be omniscient, it has to know, or he has to know, all true propositions, all true structure, but also all false propositions, all false structure that might be, all states of ignorance, all states of illusion, because that would, if he didn't have all of those finite experiences and in a way diminish himself, then that wouldn't be the fullest possible omniscience. To never participate of all of that and to always remain in this exempt state would therefore be incomplete. And I guess, again, teleologically, and to fill out omniscience, the best thing perhaps would be to go ahead and voluntarily descend, just like the Avatar voluntarily descends into the world, but not in the exact same way, but to engage in some kind of self-simulation, a virtual experience, Maya, of separation and illusion and ignorance, and then to draw back all of the goods that specifically come from those states. Just like in Neoplatonism, it's argued that evil is itself privatory. It's not a positive substance like things from God. God is not the cause of evil in that sense. Evil is a kind of misalignment of forces in one thing, things aren't balanced, or there's something missing, there's an absence. But it's good that evil exists overall because evil affords opportunity for growth. It affords opportunity for benefits directly on the part of even wrongdoers. But there are silver lining goods that come from evil existing, and therefore it's better that evil exists. And so, therefore, it would be better for God to go ahead and descend all the way through the ranks of being himself so that he personally can have all of those silver lining goodnesses, but then on the reversion back up to his true nature as all of these finite versions of himself attain this gnosis of their true identity, all of the illusory aspects and evils fall away, and all that's left, though, is something greater than, in some sense, the original undescended state. So in some way, then, the procession out and the reversion back amounts to a greater whole. So that's my kind of Neoplatonic-esque argument from the Advaita perspective there. I'm not totally committed to it. It's just that's what's occurred to me to resolve this kind of problem that you're talking about.
Yeah, philosophically, on the one hand, what you say is absolutely correct, that for God to be the complete, he must have complete experience, on the one hand. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that complete experience means going against his very nature itself. God's nature being that of knowledge, being that of infinite knowledge, infinite goodness, etc., etc., it doesn't mean that God necessarily has to then become infinite stupidity, infinite ignorance, etc. Rather, he has to know of it. So you're correct. When it comes to omniscience, to know of something does not necessarily mean to participate in it. You know, I know that there's a place called Japan. I've never been there. I don't need to. I have the knowledge. So there's a difference between knowledge versus participation in those factual elements that constitute the knowledge. Now, as far as what you were saying about God also experiencing that which is, let's say, the opposite of God, or being within the material world, etc. God does indeed have that knowledge. He has that knowledge through us. So again, it's not that God himself, two things. It's not that God himself needs to himself fall under ignorance, fall under illusion, end up, what's that stupid song from the late 90s? What if God were one of us? What if God were, it's not that God needs to find himself as a bum on the Bowery in New York, you see? But he needs to understand that. He needs to have that knowledge, but it's not that he has to be that. Rather, the way that he knows that is through us. That is, he is present with us as Paramatman at all times. So what you're pointing to is what Sanatana Dharma actually agrees with. That is panentheism, the idea that God is fully transcendent while at the same time immanent within the world. The only difference is this, that being immanent within the world, it doesn't mean that God has to become subject to the world. In the same way that you can imagine that a researcher, let's say a sociologist or anthropologist, in order to research something, may go to a foreign country and may observe everything and very deeply and truly understand, truly speak to the people. It's not that he has to quite literally genetically change himself and become that. He can know it. He doesn't have to become it. In the same way, God of necessity never falls under illusion, but he can understand the experience via us. And the way that this is the case is, and I'll end in just a second, the way that this is the case is this very important philosophical principle that you find, again, in Vedanta, and you have hints of it also, interestingly, in Christianity of all places. And that is the idea of God as the soul of our soul. That is God as the inner witness. That is that we as individual beings, when we fall under illusion due to our finitude, when we fall into illusion, God is ever present within us, within the very heart of our soul, observing all things. God is not in illusion, but he is with us, observing us as we do good things, as we do bad things, as we are a king in one lifetime, as we are, again, a bum in the Bowery in another lifetime. So in this way, this also is a part of his omniscience, but it's actually more than that. God's omniscience is not something that's caused. God's omniscience is a state of being. It's not like literally God is that researcher out in the field. That's not what omniscience is. It's not that, oh, you've accumulated quantitatively and factually so much knowledge that in theory you can say you know all things. Oh, but wait, I forgot to study this. Oh, let me now go into this weird ontological realm because I'm missing some knowledge. That's not the omniscience of God. Omniscience is omniscience. Omniscience is that is part of your nature that already you possess all knowledge. You don't have to do anything to possess that knowledge. So it's not that God has to fall into the material world, otherwise he's missing some experience. The cause of his knowledge is not experiential.
Right. Yeah, his knowledge would have to be impartable. It couldn't be gained piecemeal. That obviously makes sense. The problem, though, I guess, that I see in addressing this issue of omniscience being incomplete without falsehood, illusion being subsumed within that omniscience is that then if he derives some portion of his omniscience from his being with us and seeing through our perspective, doesn't that then negate or at least qualify to some degree the absolute independence of God? Doesn't then God depend on us in some limited regard?
That's a good question. No, it does not, because that is not the purpose of God being with us. He experiences what we experience as a secondary feature, but it's not his purpose in being with us. In other words, God is not present within our heart with the idea, it's not a mission on his part. Oh, let me be with every finite soul, the innumerable number of them, so that I may experience. He's with us actually for one reason and only one reason, that's love. Now, the fact that he will experience, it's somewhat similar to saying, there's a fire in that building. I see there's a child within it. I'm going to run in and save the child. Now, when you're in the building, are you going to also kind of notice, oh, yeah, the walls are gray. Oh, that's interesting. And you save the child. Well, sure, you'll experience that. Is that your purpose? No, it's not. The purpose is to save the child. In the same way, God is not with us, present within our heart at all times for the purpose of knowing. He's with us for the purpose of love, because he will not leave us alone. He does not want to abandon us. That being the case, it is grace, it is mercy that God is with us at all times. And the fact that he also sees what we're seeing and all of that, that's God is indifferent to such things, but it's simply factual. Again, like that person running into the burning building, the fact that they kind of saw what was inside the building, oh, that's factual, but it's meaningless. They ran in there to save the child.
Okay. Yeah, so if we didn't exist, would God's omniscience be complete? Because then it seems like he'd be missing that experience of ignorance if we didn't exist.
Don't take this the wrong way. Philosophically, it's a non-question. The reason why is because it's kind of like asking, what if God were not God? So in other words, our existence is actually a part of what God is, because it's like asking, again, to use this analogy, what if the sun didn't have sun rays, sunshine? What if there were not these rays coming from the sun? It's a non-question. Of necessity, that is what the sun is. The sun is bright. The sun will have rays. In the same way, it's kind of a non-question, a non-philosophical question. It's one of those questions that seem to make sense unless we understand what is the definition of God. And I would also, I don't know how much time we have, and I actually have to get going somewhat soon, but I would also like to address what you were saying before about the ineffability of God, if that's right. But only, if we've completed what we're talking about now. I just want to not forget that.
Sure, yeah, we can definitely leave it there. It just leaves some questions about, I guess, this independence dependence feature. If we're necessary and part of him, that my simple logic brain says, okay, a whole is dependent on its parts in some sense, but I don't know if that's true. But yeah, we can just leave that where it lies and then move on to this ineffability, because that's also a big part of the theological tradition, East and West. This idea of apophatic theology in I don't know if this is in the Upanishads or where, but there's this idea of like you describe God by saying what he's not, neti neti. Um,
Mhm.
yeah. So sure, ineffability.
Yeah. When it comes to the ineffability of God, interestingly, including in the Upanishads, a lot of people misunderstand what's meant by that statement, and it is there in the Upanishads, where it's explained that one of the ways in which we can understand what God is by understanding what God is not. So that's called neti neti, not this, na iti. So contracted is neti neti in Sanskrit. The truth of the matter is, and this may come as a surprise, again, in Vedanta philosophy, especially as taught specifically by the school that I represent, which is Vishishta Advaita. The Advaitins would disagree with this, but they would disagree with a lot. When it comes to Vishishta Advaita, we believe that God can be known, and God can be known philosophically. What cannot be known is the extent of God. That's what cannot be known. And what cannot be known are the, let's say, intimate internal aspects of God and God's personality versus the philosophical aspects of what God is. So it's a matter of we can know what God is, but even then, we can know what God is factually, philosophically, logically, but not to the full extent. But as far as who God is, that is what is ineffable. And even that, you can have glimpses, many glimpses, but not an infinite glimpse into that. So we make this distinction. So, in other words, actually, let me get back to what we were talking about, neti neti, because that leads into understanding what I just said. Uh, in the Upanishads, there are actually two paths. To state it in Latin Western philosophy, the via negativa versus the via positiva. In other words, when describing any object of knowledge, you can describe what it is and what it is not. For that matter, you could do that with anything. This is not an elephant. And I can go on for, of course, eternity. It's not a car, it's not a cloud, and on and on. But then there's also understanding the actual proper definition of what it is. It is a cup. Oh, you don't know what that word means? Let me describe its function, etc. And there's no limit to that either. You can go deeply into its atomic breakdown, etc. So there's the via negativa and the via positiva in understanding anything. This is true also in understanding God. So what is God? Well, we can understand what God is not. God is not evil. Like we were saying before, God is not stupid. God is not of the nature of ignorance, etc., etc. But what is interesting is people who would claim, and the Upanishads don't claim this, because the Upanishads also do explain positively what God is, Satchit Ananda, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other attributes of God. Now, what's interesting is when it comes to this idea that you can only describe God by what God is not. Well, by definition, if you're saying that God is not ignorance, then of course God is its opposite. God is wisdom. So even that falls apart. If you want to make the claim you can only approach God through via negativa, no, that's not true. The via negativa itself inherently points to the via positiva. If you can say via negativa, oh, God is not evil, then that leaves only one conclusion: God is good. You see, and like this. So this is why we take both approaches in understanding what is God. We understand what God obviously is not, but then also what God is, either approaching the topic on its own accord or in natural consequence of the via negativa. God is not evil, therefore God must be good. So we can take both approaches actually. So that's the approach that Sanatana Dharma takes.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, we know God by his effects. If God created the world, then we know at least that God is the kind of being that creates a world such as this. That seems necessary. The ineffability point, there's something to it in that I think he has to transcend logical binary categories and maybe we can't ever fully capture him with any of these syllogisms or arguments. So there's an element of apophaticism, but yeah, Catholics use this sometimes as an argument against natural theology, that we can't deduce facts from the absolute because he doesn't have a proper definition, etc. It feels like there's something right about that, but also like Vedanta takes a very holistic approach where you can have analogies that capture some aspects of the divine, or ethical demonstrable facts about the world, knowing him by his effects, or by negation as well, that gives us positive information. So totally. I would love to go much further into all of this. I know you have limited time, but before we're out of time, it might be fun to look at some questions for the chat. So go ahead, if you have questions for Acharya, ask them now. Alfred Cadeau, I want to hear your answer to this, says, ask him what he thinks Yahweh is. So what is Yahweh?
You want a real answer?
Sure.
I always have to couch my answers to controversial questions by asking such things. Do you want the real answer? In accordance with Sanatana Dharma, we do not accept the existence of Yahweh as a positive being. We don't equate Yahweh with Brahman, with the absolute, in either the Platonic, Neoplatonic sense, or in the Vedantic sense at all. We accept that Yahweh is a very limited being, that it is not a beneficent being, that it is a being that is geographically limited, really, that was initially 4,000 years ago to the Levant, that now has become extremely powerful, that is a being that is radically distinct from what all good people in their heart would call truly God.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that view. I think in the Old Testament, though, there's more than just Yahweh at work. What do you think about that possibility? There is this kind of evil spirit, but then also beyond that, Brahman, the true absolute, obviously did positively influence the Hebrew people and the Hebrew scriptures, and maybe what comes out of that in Christianity. I mean, surely, like, the true God bestows his benefits on all peoples in some regard. So, how would you approach the Bible with that in mind?
Yeah, well, of course, when we say the Bible, we have to keep in mind that there are multiple books in the Bible, and then there's the primary division of Old and New Testament. As far as the Old Testament, Sanatana Dharma rejects the vast majority of it, arguably maybe even all of it. When it comes to the New Testament, on the other hand, and this is where it gets tricky, In fact, if I can, let me back up just a pinch. First of all, we make this distinction when it comes to all of the religions within the world of two categories: dharmic. And when we say dharmic, oh no, we don't mean just Hindu, Buddhist, etc. We mean basically any non-Abrahamic religion. So dharmic religions, that includes Asatru, that includes ancient Celtic, that includes ancient Egyptian, etc. That on the one hand versus Abrahamic. And we see that radical distinction. The two do not touch in the same way that spirit and matter do not touch. That's how distinct we see the two. Abrahamism is something radically different from true religion, on the one hand. On the other hand, what's interesting is, of course, what do we mean by Abrahamism? We also even take a unique approach to that. It includes certainly Judaism, mainstream Christianity, and Islam. It also includes Baha'i. It also includes Marxism, actually, as Abrahamism translated into politics and economics. It also includes Luciferianism, because Satan is a Abrahamic being. There's no Satan in any other religion, not in that sense of this Manichaean, almost opposite of God. So that's the first distinction: Abrahamism versus Dharma. Now, when it comes to Christianity specifically, we can't just speak about biblical. We have to talk about Old versus New Testament. We accept that Jesus himself was a follower of Sanatana Dharma. That may be a controversial statement to some people, but not if you actually examine the literature. I've given several talks that are available on YouTube where I go somewhat in depth into this. Jesus is mentioned in our scriptures, in the Vedic scriptures. Very few people are aware of this. He is mentioned specifically in Bhavishya Purana, where his story is there. He's described as a Vedic sage who went to the West, compared to the Himalayas, to teach the barbarians Dharma, and that they killed him. His name is even mentioned in Sanskrit, Ishaputra. Ishaputra means literally son of God. Isha is God, Putra means the son of. So we know Jesus. We accept Jesus fully as a teacher. We don't accept him as God. We're different from Christians. We are not Christians, but we accept Jesus as one of our own. He was a great teacher. He was a great master. He went to the West to try to teach these barbaric people of the Levant area true spirituality. Not only does it show throughout the New Testament that their minds were boggled, they didn't understand what he was saying. It also shows in the New Testament that he didn't really worship Yahweh. He worshiped Abba. He worshiped God in a very different form, in a very different personality. And despite his trying to teach the barbarians as diplomatically as he could, even with that, they killed him. So we see a distinction between the Gospels versus the rest of the Bible.
Interesting. It's also interesting that Isha does kind of sound like Yeshua, or similar sounds. So Karnak asks, could a soul that has lived a rational life descend to a non-rational animal? Classic problem for Neoplatonists and Pythagoreans.
Yes, definitely. So as far as transmigration is what I assume he's asking, reincarnation, yes, the idea is that consciousness is consciousness. There's no such thing as organic matter. There's no such thing as a being who is alive, but it doesn't possess a soul. If a being has life, and that means if you have a cat and it comes up to you and affectionately starts to rub itself on your leg and purr, that's a soul. That's a unit of consciousness. And it found itself in a cat's body due to its own. It didn't say to itself at one point when it was human, oh, I think I'll be a cat in my next life. No, rather it created the conditions such that it was necessary in its future life to be in that form or any form. So when we see something that is alive, it doesn't matter if it's a cat, if it's a dog, if it's a cow, if it's a horse, if it's a human, if it's a god, because we also believe that there are higher beings called gods. But there is the external form, and then there's the unit of consciousness, the soul inside. Beings can reincarnate into any form. And that leaves an area of freedom that is mind-boggling. This is an area of freedom, but of course we're misapplying our freedom. And in our ignorance, we can choose anything. We can choose any sort of mindset such that in our next life, we can become a temporary god. A god meaning we'll live for a million years, 5 million, will be very powerful. We can be a human again, or we can be an animal, or for that matter, a demon. In Sanatana Dharma, we accept that there are demonic beings as well, and there are also souls. Why does a soul find itself in a human body, the body of a god, the body of a demon, the body of a horse? Why? One versus the other, its own choices. But a soul is a soul.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, Neoplatonists like to draw these fine distinctions where, well, the rational soul will not be corrupted, but it can assume the form of an irrational animal. But that human soul is still kind of interesting questions. But so I want to be respectful of your time. I do want to hear.
Let me just say, if you're in academia, you will meet a lot of professors who seem externally very rational, very intelligent, who, as far as their lifestyle, they're animals.
Very true. Yeah. Yeah, in the interest of being respectful to your time, I would just like to ask one last question that, again, I'm just interested in hearing your answer to. What is personhood, and is God a person?
Very nice. Oh, that's something I've written extensively about, lectured extensively about, and it's not easy to answer in that it takes some time. When I say it's not easy to answer, I don't mean that there isn't a good and cogent and logical answer. There is. Like I said, I've addressed it many times. But let me try to give a nutshell explanation of the idea of personhood. What constitutes personhood is sentiency versus insentiency, essentially. So from the perspective of Sanatana Dharma, the idea of personality is non-distinct from consciousness itself. So thus, if you look at anything that is insentient by definition, it does not have personality. What is meant by personality now? Personality is that extension of one's consciousness that one extends to another and that is perceived by that person. So, in other words, right now, I am perceiving your personality. You are perceiving my personality. What does that actually mean? What you're perceiving is my consciousness as you are indeed experiencing it, and vice versa. That's what is the definition of personality itself. So, in a way, it's non distinct from consciousness, it's just a perspectival difference and perspectival definition of consciousness itself. That being the case, they're really non distinct. And more importantly, now personality, as seen from the perspective of the individual who possesses that personality, it is how they, as an individual unit of consciousness, wish to express themselves as that individual unit of consciousness in accordance with their desire and their will. So, thus, why am I expressing myself in every way? How I look, how you're experiencing me, how I sound, etc. I'm choosing to, I desire to. So thus, in that way, now understood functionally, still it is non-distinct. That is, personality is really non-distinct from myself as a unit of consciousness. So that's how personality is understood, is that consciousness and personality are the same. All that being the case, obviously God has personality. Now, having made that what I assume is a philosophically controversial statement, which it shouldn't be, let me also give this caveat. There is a difference between personality and persona. And this is the difficulty that people always have with this. So thus there's an entire silly school of psychology called transpersonal psychology, for example. This idea that personality is something that is material. Personality is something that is of the nature of evil, that is the nature of the material. No, there's a difference between personality versus persona. Persona is fake personality. Persona is personality seen through the prism of ahankara, of false ego. That's persona. So therefore, like so many people do, if a person wanted to have a fake personality, they're actually very scared inside, but they put on a brave face. That's persona. That's fake. That's different from personality, which is inherent to who the person is as consciousness. The personality is eternal. Persona comes and goes and changes from lifetime to lifetime, situation to situation. So we are personalities in that higher sense of that term. So is God. And as far as why, I can go into that. But again, that would take about another 10, 15 minutes. But again, I have. There are videos where I explain this. And in my main book, Sanatana Dharma, The Eternal Natural Way, I go very deeply into what is the nature of God's personality, why God of necessity must have personality in this higher sense, not persona, not limited and flawed, quote unquote, personality, but true personality, i.e., how God chooses to express himself. That's what personality means.
All right. Yeah. Beautiful. Very interesting. As I'm looking at Christianity, I'm looking deeper at this issue of the divine personality and what exactly the sense of hypostasis is for Neoplatonists versus Christians. This personality term is thrown in there. So that was very helpful in understanding the Sanatana Dharma perspective on the issue. And I will ask, just because he's told me to ask 3 or 4 times now, so Odd wants to know, do you think that I should regrow my beard or not?
I am partial to beards, as you can see.
Okay, well, there you have it.
Myself, let me tell you, I've gone back and forth. When I was in graduate school, I had a beard. When I graduated, I shaved it off. Now I've had a beard for maybe 6 years, something like that. So, it comes and goes with myself. So there are arguments for both sides.
Right. I like the beard in the winter, shaved in the summer. Stay cool. But anyway, this has been very enlightening, enjoyable, and I'd be glad to discuss many more topics that we just kind of touched on here, and I'm sure we could go on for hours. But yeah, very grateful for Acharya for joining us today. Any last kind of thoughts for the audience, or where can they find your books, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure. Well, let me deal with the latter first. As far as finding my books, again, you can go to our main website, dharmacentral.com, and most, if not all, of the books are available there. As far as last words, let me just say this again how I began. I just want to, first of all, thank you for having me on. And I want to also tell your audience, that they're very, very fortunate to have you because, again, I've dealt with every sort of intellectual, pseudo intellectual, want to be intellectual upon the face of the earth, from people with literally three PhDs to internet personalities. And I can see that from speaking of personhood, personal, from a personal perspective, the approach that you take to these topics is the approach that one should take. That is not hyper intellectual for its own sake. Let me tell you, again, I'm a person who I'm extremely educated, and I've known, I've rubbed elbows with some of the most intelligent people literally on the face of the earth. I personally would rather associate with someone who just has humility and is sincere and wants to know the truth, regardless of how much education they have, than someone who has three PhDs, but there's no sincerity to them. It's all just academic. The way that we know God, the way that we know truth is precisely what I can see is your approach, and that is with humility, sincerity, a little bit of quietness, just wanting to know the truth and really, really pursuing it regardless of anything. This is how we know truth is we have to want it more than we want anything else. It has to be not a hobby for us. It has to be not just something that is an internet bred, kind of game. For myself, I'm old enough that I gained all of my knowledge before there was an internet, before it even existed. And this is how we know truth is again with humility, sincerity, and true contemplation, just inquiring in a real way, and embracing what we see as true. And regardless of anything, even if it seems to attack some presupposition that we may have had, if it's true, it's true, and we embrace it, and that's it. So I want to congratulate you for taking this absolutely beautiful and wonderful approach to truth. So thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure and my honor.
Absolutely, and I see the same in you. And another thing about learning the truth is, taking advantage of great teachers. And I consider you a great teacher, and you have a wealth of knowledge that we could all benefit from. So I encourage everyone in the audience seek out Acharya's material on YouTube and elsewhere. And it's been again a great honor to speak with you. Namaste.
Namaste.